For my final B&B project, I decided to focus on self-esteem and the way that self-esteem impacts people and the different aspects that go into making someone more or less confident. So just as sort of a basic definition of self-esteem, self-esteem is a realistic, appreciative perspective of oneself. And one thing that's really difficult about self-esteem is that it's about maintaining balance in kind of how much you appreciate yourself and how much you love yourself. So trying to make sure you are confident enough, but also have a kind of humble and realistic perspective of yourself. One thing that's actually relatively new to the scientific and psychological study of self-esteem is where it physically takes place in the brain and kind of where biologically it's determined whether or not we will have high amounts of self-esteem. And so here's a top view and a side view of the brain. And the place where self-esteem is actually determined is called the frontostriatal pathway. And this pathway connects two different important aspects of the brain. It connects the medial prefrontal cortex, which deals with self-knowledge, and it connects the ventral striatum, which deals with motivation and reward. And it has recently been determined that the pathway is kind of a road between the two different important parts of the brain in terms of self-esteem, the medial prefrontal cortex and the ventral striatum. And the stronger the road, the higher the self-esteem that someone will have in the long term. So permanent self-esteem, as opposed to just temporary self-esteem. So these new discoveries about self-esteem in the brain have kind of re-brought up the discussion about nature versus nurture when it comes to self-esteem, and whether self-esteem is something that is passed along in our DNA, and it's whether it's something that is kind of genetically transferred in the sense of our parents' own self-esteem levels could have impact how we feel about ourselves, or whether it is more nurture and about the way that we are raised and how we perform academically in school, and as we are growing up, kind of how we are taught that we should see ourselves based on our accomplishments throughout childhood. And the concept of nurture in self-esteem has a large part to do with parents and the kind of parental impact on the child's perspective of themselves. And so if a parent is constantly telling a kid that they are perfect and that they're doing everything right as they're growing up, then the child will have a very different perspective on themselves than if their parent is saying you are not good enough and you need to work harder. People often wonder where self-esteem comes from, and if it is primarily nurture as opposed to nature, then how is it that actually comes into play? And so this has to do with parental encouragement, as I've talked about, coaching, so influential people in a kid's life, nutrition and diet and exercise can also impact how one sees themselves, their level of education, and kind of the way that they are taught in school can impact how they view themselves academically, the different medications that they may be on, and then additional resources could also impact their self-esteem. And also sleep can have a big impact on how someone sees himself, especially during the teenage years. So their overall happiness is determined. And one distinction that I want to make is that narcissistic personality disorder is not the same as someone who has high self-esteem. Someone who has high self-esteem can be humble, or someone who has narcissistic personality disorder tends to be a bit more aggressive. The next important topic that I want to focus on is gender and self-esteem, and how your gender can greatly impact kind of how you view yourself, and then the roles that society has placed on males and females. And so before I go into gender, I need to tell you the main three types of self-esteem are performance, social, and appearance self-esteem. And so for the most part, boys and girls have insignificant differences when it comes to performance and social self-esteem, but for appearance, girls tend to have quite a bit lower self-esteem than boys do. And this has to do with the fact that there are different expectations put on boys and girls that will impact their gender, especially during the teenage years. So boys tend to be expected to be more macho and tough and strong, where girls have to be more delicate and timid and light, and therefore this will change the way that boys and girls will see themselves, because they have different expectations of kind of what they have to be in society. So therefore they will evaluate themselves with different standards. And in terms of girls, almost 7 out of 10 girls believe that they are not good enough in some way, whether that be appearance or social or academic. They wish that they could change something about themselves. And part of the reason that teens tend to have such low self-esteem is because they're in this stage of identity versus role confusion. So teens tend to be confused about where they fit in and if they belong with their peers. And so often they will compare themselves to the people around them and tend to kind of be very down on themselves and have low self-esteem, even if it's something that's not really true, because they're kind of struggling to find out where they fit in society. And this is especially true with girls. So almost 75% of girls who have low self-esteem will engage in some sort of negative activity, such as cutting or developing an eating disorder, or using drugs and alcohol, or bullying people around them. One in 5 teenagers will experience some form of depression before they turn 18, and this has to do with low self-esteem. And part of the reason that suicide rates in teens are so high is because of the low self-esteem that is put on teenagers during high school. Here's a TED Talk video that I found, and I just wanted to share a little clip with you all because I think it's really important and sends a good message about self-esteem.
I landed myself a job working with young women. My job was to create a program for them to help them increase their self-esteem, which of course was kind of laughable because I had no self-esteem myself. But I started to wonder, could we create our own self-esteem? Could we build it ourselves? And I did a little research, and it turns out that self-esteem, it's just based on our own thoughts of ourselves. And I knew that we could control our own thoughts, and so I thought, yeah, maybe we could actually start to build our own self-esteem. And I was willing to try.
And a big issue for teenagers is when they kind of look in the mirror and think about themselves, it's, what do I actually like what I see, and am I happy with the person that I am today? And so part of that is kind of being in touch with your mind and your heart and making sure that you kind of are aware of who you are and kind of truly like yourself. And one thing that's actually very positive about self-esteem is that it can really be a self-fulfilling prophecy, which is basically the idea that you can kind of make something come true if you believe it hard enough. And so if you act more confident, you can actually become more confident and raise your self-esteem. And there are specific actions that people can take to kind of improve their self-esteem and make themselves feel better about themselves. And so part of this is to dress nicely and to feel put together, and all of these I found online as tips and tricks to kind of make yourself more confident. You can also kind of Photoshop your attitude and your self-image, so that's kind of making yourself feel better about the person that you really are. And then also just having more positive thoughts can make yourself a more positive person. And sleeping more is a big one, and smiling more, and being kind and generous to those around you. So if your relationships are stronger, then you will tend to feel better about yourself. And so if you just changing small habits can also make yourself feel better about your everyday life and your activity. And so all of these are really great ways to kind of improve your happiness with yourself and make yourself a more confident person who has very high self-esteem and truly loves themselves.